So I'd like to invite up the discussants, the speakers for today's panel, the Plenary Masterclass on Food Alert. And we have Chris Hagedorn, who is online. He's the Adjunct Professor of Global Food Politics Sciences at Paul University and former CFS Secretary. So he's joining us online today. We have Debbie C. Araba, Senior Consultant with the African Development Bank on Agriculture and Food Systems. Please come up. And we have Indira Bose, who is from the ANH Academy, LSHTM. Please come up. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much. Good afternoon, everyone. Well, I hope you received at least some nourishment over the coffee break, and everyone's alert, unintended, to enjoy this session. We'll be brief, but what we hope to do is create a learning experience for you, give you the foundational understanding of simulating food system stresses and why it's important to consider this tool as one of the many in your arsenal as you work on building and fortifying resilience towards shocks and stresses. As already announced, my name is Debbie C. Araba. I'm a senior consultant at the African Development Bank working on food systems. With me, it's the one and only Indira Bose. Indira is a research fellow at the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, working with the ANH Academy. Her research focuses on interrelationships between water security, food security, and health, with a particular focus on the impacts of climate. Prior to joining the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, she worked at the World Food Programme, where she worked on the development of Fill the Nutrient Gap, an analytical approach aimed to support governments to design evidence-based strategies to improve affordability and accessibility of nutritious diets. In this role, she worked closely with governments across Asia, Latin America, and Sub-Saharan Africa. She also worked in WFP country offices across Asia and Southern Africa. Joining us online and virtually is my dear friend, Chris Hagedorn. He's an adjunct professor of global food politics at Sciences Po University in Paris, where he teaches graduate courses on food systems and the links between food, climate, and health. Chris is a former US diplomat. He spent more than 3 decades in international development and multilateralism, serving tours in Asia, Africa, and the Near East, as well as the UN, including nearly 4 years as the executive secretary of the United Nations Committee on World Food Security in Rome. All right. Now, in the words of a great philosopher of our time, Mike Tyson, and for those of you who've done any work remotely related to strategy, you've likely heard this quote before. Everyone has a plan until you get punched in the mouth. There's always a plan. The best laid plans, but the reality is there are things we know, and they're the things we don't know. And in the words of, I suppose, Donald Rumsfeld, there are the unknown unknowns. There are things you don't even know you don't know. So how do you plan in a world that's constantly shifting? Positions are shifting, loyalties are shifting, context continues to shift. Between 2020 and 2022, we witnessed an unprecedented global pandemic that I would say revealed a lot about the vulnerabilities of global systems, food systems inclusive. And I think it's heightened our awareness of the vulnerabilities of our systems to shocks and stresses. So, Indira, beginning here at these vulnerabilities to shocks and stresses, could you walk us through, what was experienced in your perspective from your work at the WFP?
Sure, thanks, DBC. So perhaps I can speak to my experiences when I was working in the WFP country office in Cambodia and the shocks we faced in 2020. So first to say that even before 2020, thinking about how we build resilience and making sure that we are really prepared for emergencies was something that we were very deeply thinking about in Cambodia. Cambodia is one of the countries that's most vulnerable to climate change. There's floods on a recurrent, very regular basis. Droughts also happen periodically. In, I think, 2015 to 16, there was a massive drought brought about by El Nino, which affected 2.5 million people. So we'd already been really thinking about this, trying to build analytical systems, really work on emergency preparedness, develop early warning systems. Even we did some simulations to try and make sure we had protocols in place of how to respond quickly when a flood happens. However, in 2020, as was the case globally, we faced this unprecedented shock of the COVID-19 pandemic. And we found ourselves, as many other countries, deeply unprepared. Now, Cambodia, unlike some countries, didn't have widespread local transmission of COVID in 2020. At least, I mean, this changed in 2021. So there wasn't these kind of wide lockdowns or things like that. But there were still huge effects and huge economic effects on the country, where some of the main industries were very vulnerable, such as the garment industry and also the tourism industry. So this had huge impacts. But we also, this shock and the kind of rapid closure of borders revealed some weaknesses in the food system that we weren't even aware of initially. So in the initial weeks, days of the pandemic, we started to see that even though staple foods, say, the prices remained quite consistent, Cambodia is a net rice exporter, we found that actually fresh foods like vegetables were rapidly increasing in price, up to some commodities up to 60%. And also eggs as well. And, you know, I'm sure many of you in the room have a nutritional background. These type of fresh commodities are really important for dietary diversity, are really important to make sure good nutrition. And it didn't last for long, but it showed us these weaknesses. And then in addition to this, we also in 2020 experienced wide-scale flash flooding. And this affected about 800,000 people. The combination of these two shocks simultaneously, even though we'd been thinking about floods, really exacerbated stresses. And even though this was a risk that we had been thinking about and to some extent trying to prepare for, we still found that there were fragmented systems and issues that we didn't anticipate. I can just, if I can take one more minute, I'm not being super brief, not learning from the Deputy Prime Minister at all. That, you know, I worked on the kind of analytical side of things. And so we got these flood extent maps, which is what you use initially to try and identify who are the most vulnerable. And we received two different ones that showed different things, both based on remote sensing models. And both were valid, but they showed different things. And then trying to reconcile that in an emergency when you're trying to respond rapidly is something that's incredibly difficult, incredibly stressful. And it kind of showed us even other weaknesses that we were not prepared for. So I'm excited to participate and learn a bit more about how we could be better prepared in the future.
Thank you very much, Indira. You know, nothing teaches you better than experiencing, right? Or an experience. You learn best through experience. But when we talk about these shocks, you know, the next best thing we have is a simulation. And through simulations, I suppose you get all the benefits of experiencing it without the negative side of things. In 2012, related to your experience in Cambodia, in 2012, I was a senior advisor in the government in Nigeria. And in October, just at the tail end of the rainy season, we had unprecedented floods in the southern and eastern parts of the country, devastating, you know, significant parts of agrarian areas. And it was first, we had the regular floods from the rains, and then a neighboring country, Cameroon, to the east of Nigeria, opened floodgates for their dam that was at risk of failing. And so there was a second episode. And that completely threw the plans, just gummed up all the works. All the plans the government had to respond to the floods went out the window. Now you had a crisis response. So there was a food security response, but at the same time, you had a food production response because a lot of the food producing areas were now inundated. Now, in response to this, ultimately, Nigeria reached out to the CGIAR, International Water Management Institute, and they worked on mapping the flood areas, plotted the rate of recession, and then with food aid, they also shared planting materials, seed, and other inputs to those vulnerable communities to take advantage of those rich alluvial deposits to double crop short or early maturing varieties to ensure that there wouldn't be any food price spikes and loss of food or food availability. Now, lessons learned. Nigeria developed an agriculture resilience framework, but these events, Indira, it gets me thinking: are they systemic in terms of, okay, we experience these shocks, but how do we learn? What do we learn and how do we learn, and how does that translate into stronger or more resilient policy systems and programs? And with this, I'd like to hopefully, invoke the presence of a third participant on this panel, Chris. Chris, are you online? I'm not sure. So, Chris, we talk about these shocks earlier. Indira gave us the example of Cambodia. I've given the example of Nigeria's shock in 2012. But what you're about to propose is learning through experience without the negative externalities. Now, could you walk us through that? Like, what is a food system simulation? How do you do it? What goes into it? And then what are the outcomes? Over to you.
With pleasure. Thank you, Debisi. And of course, it's great working with you again. You and I have known each other as friends and working partners for the last decade after the Global Alliance of Climate Smart Agriculture. As we knew, climate change was going to be wreaking havoc on food systems and food security way back then, but the international community was having trouble fitting agriculture into the climate COPs, the UNFCCC process. So yes, this is not a new process. You mentioned emergencies in 2012 in Nigeria, in Cambodia. Indira just described some of the serious threats, the floods. And so here, I've been working in this area of food security and food systems for a long time. And at the global scale, when I was leading the Secretariat of the Committee on World Food Security in Rome, these were issues that were quite pressing, and trying to look ahead to understand the complexity of food systems and what needs to be done by all of us, from the individual level to governments at local, national, sub-regional, regional, and global levels. And this is super hard work, but when I got to France, and I'm so sorry I'm not there in person with you. I as a pending immigrant to France, I am stuck in the bureaucracy and was unable to travel. But I'm glad to be able to share with you the experience that I created called Food Alert, which was an expert workshop. We invited about 65 experts from government, from private industry, from NGOs and academia, and a number of prominent journalists to explore the scenarios that we created, climate-driven food supply shocks to the European Union, and how players at various levels, various roles, would interpret those crisis scenarios and respond with policy recommendations. Now, we had worked with the department, it's called the Directorate of Agriculture, or DG Agri, and other European Commission colleagues, as well as experts we put together from the OECD, from think tanks here in France. And we came up with a very well-researched and very detailed 3D scenario, and I'll walk you through a little bit of that. We had funding from the Dutch government, we had funding from EIT Food, And we were able to, in a very short time, design a program for, as I said, about 60 people. We broke them into 3 groups, one assigned to look at short-term, the other medium, and the third group, the long-term. So can you move the slides ahead? So as Debisi and Indira clearly mentioned, we all know threats and risks to the food systems are mounting, whether that's from climate, whether it's from trade disputes, pandemics like COVID, or natural disasters. And of course, around the world, we're seeing conflicts that are just getting more and more severe. When we were doing this 2-day workshop in Brussels, it just happened to coincide with massive farmer protests. A number of the participants thought we had arranged that on purpose, but no, it was just coincidence. But after 3 days of protests in Brussels, store shelves were absolutely empty, and it was shocking to see that. I'm sure some of you have had similar experiences, but it's quite unusual, particularly in the capital of Europe. Now, we stress test lots of things, banking, electronics, computer systems, but when I started asking the question, who is stress testing food systems, the answer was essentially no one. Or, modeling was being done, people were considering certain war game scenarios, but systematic stress testing of food systems just simply didn't exist. So our effort was meant to start a process, create a methodology, and stress test the European food system. So this, it may be a little too detailed for a big room like this, but essentially the methodology was to bring people together over 2 days, assign them a role. And these are roles that were not their normal daily work, in order to give them a very different perspective, a more holistic perspective on food crises generally. We took them through a very detailed crisis scenario for which we created a mobile phone-based application in which people were receiving news alerts and were able to communicate with each other and the organizers. And we had 3 videos, each of which was set for a 6-month period, so people could basically be taken into the future over 1.5 years to see how an aggravated food crisis can get worse and worse and worse. And then we asked them to meet in plenary to come up with proposals for policy solutions. Now, I'll walk you through. Okay, this is the process. In the interest of time, I'll skip ahead so we can get some questions from the audience. But this is the process by which a shock occurs, impacting imports and exports. Europe, for example, imports 70% of all of its seafood. It's very reliant on edible oils such as palm oil, sunflower oil, the kind of things that were in short supply after Russia's invasion of Ukraine, for example. So this is, as I said, it was very well researched. It's too small to see, but these are the long list of items that were considered as part of the research. And then everything was put into the next slide, into a very detailed 3D, well, it essentially looks like an electronic component board, but it's essentially a 3D scenario of how one food crisis in one place can impact other parts of the system. Yeah, we're not going to show the video just in the interest of time, but you can see this on our website as well as the report. So our goal was to have the recommendations from the 65 experts from around Europe at both regional and national and city level. These were the assignments given to the 3 groups. Here are some of the responses that they came up with. And these are, there are roughly 4 each per group. And they're summarized in, not the next slide, but the one to follow. But this is the immediate crisis response. And you'll see that the first one is talking about food reserves. Now, this is something that's being talked about more and more, but it's very, very expensive. Right? The idea is to rely on an open and reliable international trading system. But in times of crisis, obviously, these things are fragile. This is more the medium term. And Again, sort of looking at issues of availability and access. The policy proposals were to increase investments in innovation. That clearly is happening in Africa quite widely. Different types of crops for food as opposed to biofuels, another key issue on the political front, and reducing capped subsidies for livestock. And on the finance side, again, the questions here were how to support farmers and food producers, how the EU as a single political entity can jointly purchase foods to benefit from economies of scale. That could be considered in Africa as well. And of course, how to deal with the major problem, which is speculation, where financial investors are driving the price up in times of crisis. All of these are captured in this slide. And again, this is on our website. And the report I point you to again on the website for more details about the policy recommendations, the methodology, and the individuals who were involved. And so the question I put in the next slides is really about how is this relevant to Africa? Who takes responsibility? As Debisi said, what are the lessons learned? How do we learn? And how are those lessons translated into new policies and new programs, right? At governmental level, at the private sector level, the insurance industry, the retail industry, the wholesale industry, all of these folks who are involved in maintaining healthy supply chains to make sure that in times of crisis, there are solutions ready. So it's not getting punched in the face and figuring out everything for the first time. So this is some of the media. Again, this is all located on our website. Again, the question is, how is it relevant for Africa? We can talk about that in the coming minutes. And again, how would stress testing be used? Would it be a continental, a sub-regional, a national, a local? How can stress testing be deployed in Africa effectively to learn lessons without having to go through the pain and suffering of future crises? And here's the information where you can find both the reports, our website, and our LinkedIn page. So again, apologies for not being there in person. I would love to talk to you. Anybody interested in following up, please let us know either by email or through Debisi. Dr. Araba, back to you, Debisi.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Chris. You know, just watching those slides, it takes me back to 2015 when I participated in a food simulation, food chain reaction. It was organized by CNA, the Center for Naval Analysis in Washington, D.C. And one of the key outcomes, at least for me, was how vulnerable every country potentially is. And potentially, I suppose, how more robust and more resilient we could be if we collaborated more meaningfully. So these simulations, how we simulate food systems, they're meant to create these high resolution insights on the strengths as well as the vulnerabilities of existing systems. But what they should also do is provoke introspection that leads to changes and hopefully, takes us on that pathway of transformation. It's not always the case because it's not a one and done thing. You don't simulate one time, you get your insights, you write up your document and you think, yes, we're done. Now, why is that? Because the world is constantly changing. I mean, I take us back in Chris's presentation, we saw him give examples of COVID, the Russia-Ukraine crisis. Most recently, we've got the tariff crisis, if it's a crisis in some ways. And then, of course, for those who've been paying attention to the news, brewing conflict, emerging conflict in the Middle East. Now, Indira, I know we had agreed we were going to loop in the delegates and you're going to get your money's worth this afternoon. You're not just here to listen to two people physically and one person virtually. We want you to think deeply about how in your respective organizations or as a national, how you experienced a recent shock of global proportions. So I think one that is perhaps more easily relatable is the global pandemic. How did you experience the pandemic in your respective organizations and your countries? And then can you, if anyone is brave enough, I think, do we have media? Do we have a roaming microphone? Yes? Okay, we do. All right, thank you. Can you share with us what's changed? What did you learn from this shock in your line of work, in food systems? What did you learn from the impact of COVID? And how has that influenced changes in food systems in your respective case? Does anyone have a relevant example? First of all, did we all experience COVID? I mean, you know. All right. Okay, great. We've got a hand over here.
Thank you. I thought I will kick this off.
Thank you. As you start, sorry to interrupt you. Please introduce yourself and then give us the context. Thank you.
Thank you. Ahmed Kaplan. I am. Sorry. I am Ahmed Kaplan. I have worked in food system as a food system advisor and at USAID, and currently vice president of WISE, consulting firm, global consulting firm. We all know the impact of COVID, and I was living in Washington, D.C. at that time. And one of the first things you notice, the impact of COVID on the local food system, but that also a cascade of or translate to the weaknesses we have seen in the food system. Empty grocery store shelves, food are not available. Back then, we will order things online through a system called Instacart in DC. And you bought 20 items and you wait and wish for the best to get one or two of these items. At the same time, we see reporting news from the farms who were providing this food to the grocery stores, but due to the break in the whole value chain of supply chain, we see them blowing their food in the field, dumping milk in the field because they did not have enough storage capacity, but also there was the transport system, whole chain has been broken. Prices went up and food was not available in the diversity that you used to. Not that we were suffering or hungry or malnourished or any of this, but the availability of the food was hard to get the thing right. I remember the first time I managed to get one item I always bought in my shopping cart and was never available. Sorry, I mean, not that I'm spoiled, but was dark chocolate. I'm used to have some chocolate with my morning coffee. The first time I received the dark chocolate, I was jumping up and down. It's a simple delicacy that you don't realize the value of the small things and the importance of a functional food system and supply chain unless you lose or that thing is broken down. And I think that was a wake-up call globally for the interconnectivity of the food system. The global food system is not only what we see in our immediate vicinity or local grocery store, it is the effect transfer or transport across the globe from A to Z.
Thank you very much. Any other examples of how you experienced the shock, but what's changed? How have you responded? How, do we have examples of whether it's national systems, institutional systems, or are systems adapting? Is that paradigm flawed that we experience and then we change or we don't change?
Hi, thank you. My name is Thalia Sparling. I'm with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine and the ANH Academy. And I'm cheating a bit because Indira and I discussed this before, but when we were in Malawi, it was on the tail of Hurricane Freddie. And we were discussing this in the context of anticipatory action systems that had been set up in the country. And I'm sure my Malawian colleagues could speak to this more specifically than I can. But when I was speaking to them about what they had planned for and what there was actually quite a bit of planning around flooding, which happened during the hurricane. But in fact, the real fallout turned out to be the mudslides and the landslides, and that caused quite a bit of, actually much more mortality and disruption of the infrastructure. So those have implications obviously for food systems, but they also have implications for families and farmers. And I think just to be slightly provocative, I would say with something like Food Alert, with something like these planning systems, it would be very interesting. There seems to be an endless permutations and iterations of how crisis unfolds, and it always is in ways we don't really expect. And it's been a criticism of models we've built for future scenarios. It may have been also come up in the discussions around Food Alert, but I guess I would be curious to know, in this endless scenario of not being able to anticipate the real sort of crux of the impact, not just the typology of the crisis itself, how you would incorporate that.
Yeah, that's a very good question, Chris. So are we planning, when we talk about resilience, are we building resilience to crises, or are we trying to build resilient systems? And how do you ensure that you're optimizing for one over the other?
Yeah, I didn't catch the name of the young lady who just made the point, asked a question, but with Food Alert, I mean, we clearly recognize that, right? Lightning never strikes the exact same place twice, so it's impossible to understand or predict exactly what the next crisis will be. But there is value, and I think Debisi, you hinted at this earlier in your remarks, there is value in thinking through and preparing for crisis period, right? That goes to the systemic level. So there's a muscle memory in place, right? And particularly at the Debisi, I'll give you credit for mentioning this. This is really your analysis, where you said getting middle managers accustomed to stress testing, accustomed to planning both pre and post emergency crisis scenario, that has incalculable benefits that you just simply can't put a price tag on. You can't estimate exactly what that value is, but you know, when you've been practicing, you know, why do firefighters practice putting out fires, right? It's the exact same concept. You need to understand, you know, what are the contingencies, what are the decision points, who is responsible for what? And yeah, no plan survives a punch in the face, but you know, once that sting wears off, you can keep going forward. And I hope that's helpful. And the gentleman, Ahmed, who pointed out how much we take for granted things like availability of food in our grocery stores, you know, what's the, you know, how do you prepare for tomorrow when there is not just no dark chocolate, but there's no protein source, there's no carbohydrates, there's no fruits and vegetables, or you see the prices, as Indira described in Cambodia, going through the roof. So these are all things that have to be thought about and prepared for.
Thank you very much, Chris. Indira, how do you use the lessons learned from simulations to feedback and enhance resilience, as well as to strengthen preparedness? How do you do that?
It's an easy question, right? I mean, I think this is tricky, right? It's very difficult to shift systems and to really learn and adapt. But I mean, I don't think I have a like silver bullet as to how you can use these simulations. But I do think, as Chris said, practicing and learning by doing is really how we can move forward. And I think as I was listening to you, Chris, there was a question that sprang to mind. You talked about how you get different actors to role play different roles. And I think that's obviously interesting to give people a different perspective. But how about also the people that are working in these roles being able to practice, to be able to understand the different challenges, also learn from other people who are doing similar roles, maybe in other contexts? I think, you know, what I found, you know, working in different settings is that sometimes this may not have happened before in this context, but sometimes similar challenges and lessons can be drawn from other places that are really valuable.
Can I quickly respond to that, Debisi?
Go ahead, Chris. Go ahead.
And Indira, your point is exactly right? Role playing gives a better understanding of what others are experiencing. That's the point of at least our methodology, but there are others. Now, as I said, we were working very closely with the European Commission governance system. They loved the fact that we were doing this because they didn't have money in the budget to do it themselves. So while they didn't give us funding, they did give us a lot of support and a lot of time, and managed to bring in very senior European officials for the final briefing to hear recommendations from the experts. But the role-playing issue doesn't necessarily have to be, there are different ways to do it. But what's most important, after COVID and after the invasion of Ukraine, the European Union, European Commission, with its Joint Research Center, its research body, set up something called the EFSCM, or the European Food Security Crisis Monitoring Group. Now, this is a group of all member states and about 50 organizations, all in all parts of the food system. We are briefing them this summer, in fact, on their own, they are creating their own stress testing methodology and system. And the fact that we were, that we created this on our own, that we brought this to the European Union, gave them a huge amount of impetus, energy, and ideas for taking this forward. So if that's something that can be done by local African leaders at local level, national level, regional level, that's, I guess I would just say, don't be afraid to push. Your leaders are elected to lead, and they're representing you. So, encourage them to be creative, to do this kind of thing, and to get foundations and others to fund this kind of work. Over.
Well, thank you. Thank you very much, Chris. I think we're at the tail end of this session. As we're bringing this to a close, I'm hoping you have an appreciation of the complexity of what it means. I know we mouth it off. It's a buzzword: resilience, resilience, resilience. What does it mean to have a resilient food system? What are the decision-making sort of tiers of decision-making? Should some things be more centralized? Should others be decentralized? The simulations help us to surface. I'd use the analogy of high resolution. It brings a mirror, very close, or a microscope, even, to observe all the parts of the food systems: communications, decision-making, research, technology, practice, etc. How are decisions made? How do you absorb information? How do you distill it? How do you come up with insights? And how do you take action? Does it depend on the say-so of an individual? If it's an individual, what if, as most recently, I think there was a power outage at Heathrow Airport, and the administrator was asleep and couldn't make decisions? And he was hauled before Parliament, and he was apologizing. I mean, if it's that centralized, how vulnerable is that system if there's a single point of failure? Do we need more decentralized systems? And do all parts of the food system need to be decentralized? These are the questions that we need to ask ourselves without, having blanket words like resilience, because resilience means action in practice. I want to give, again, I'd said, the peerless Indira Bose, the final word in this session. Indira, you know, what key message do you hope the delegates, both online and in this room, you know, what key message do you want them to take away when they think about stress testing food systems and why it's valuable?
I mean, I think the reality is we're facing a time where climate change, other stresses, other shocks are going to keep really disrupting food systems. So we do need to be thinking about how to make it more resilient. We need to think about really investing in preparedness. And so I think the question is to really understand, what does that mean? I think, you know, I think about systems, food systems, say in the Cambodian experience, these systems are a little bit, they're complex. It's not simple supply chains. There are informal markets, there are informal traders. It's how do we kind of even try to capture and understand all of that information to really know what's happening and build that resilience. So I guess it's sort of a question to think about, how does this relevant in your system? How can you really try in complex settings where these food chains, where these food systems are very complex, how we can really think about doing this in the future?
There's a second delay after I switch on the microphone. So thank you very much, Indira. Chris, thank you very much for joining us all the way from Europe. I know we've invoked your presence via the wonders of modern technology. Ladies and gentlemen, both in the room and online, I thank you for your time. Please give it up to our distinguished speakers.